Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Inanna Hamati-Ataya and I'm the founding director of GLONOS, the Center for Global Knowledge Studies at the University of Cambridge, one of the many co-sponsors of today's event. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome you all to the official launch of Mapping, Connectivity and the Making of European Empires, a volume co-edited by Luis Lobo-Guerrero, Laura Presti and Filipe dos Reis, and which has just been published by Rowman and Littlefield in its series on global epistemics. So many congratulations to the editors and all the authors who contributed to this volume. We are operating in a hybrid format today in collaboration with our host, the Library of the National Maritime Museum of the Netherlands in Amsterdam, where several participants are gathered, while the rest of us are scattered across various locations. I want to take this opportunity to thank all the colleagues who have helped with the organization and publicization of this event, especially Zara Kars at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, Diederick Wildeman at the National Maritime Museum in Amsterdam, as well as Maria Goed at the Library of the Museum, Michael Hicks from the University of Groningen, and Samantha Peel from GLONOS at the University of Cambridge. Before we begin, a few words on the organization of today's session. We will first have general introductions by Diederick Wildeman and myself, followed by a discussion of the book with Dr. Djoeke van Netten and the three editors, all of whom I will introduce in greater detail as we move along. We will then open the discussion to members of the audience for a Q&A session. So please keep your microphones muted until then, if you are joining us over Zoom. And if you'd like to ask a question, you can type it in the chat box at any time during the conversation, or raise your physical or virtual hand during the Q&A. I will now hand over to Diederick Wildeman, who will officially inaugurate our conversation. Diederick is a curator of seamanship and library collections at the National Maritime Museum of the Netherlands in Amsterdam. After studying at the Naval Academy and the University of Applied Sciences for Library and Documentary Information, Diederick studied history at both Leiden and Amsterdam. And at the moment, he is preparing a dissertation on the history of 17th century exploration. Diederick, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for this introduction and welcome to the Library of Maritime Museum in Amsterdam for the presentation of the book Mapping, Connectivity and the Making of European Empires. As said, my name is Diederick Wildeman. I'm curator of what's also called navigation, cartography and library collections here at the museum. And we are very delighted that we can hold this presentation here in our library. And in the subject of the book, I have browsed through it, is very well matched with this museum. The museum has a large collection of maps and charts, and is in fact one of the most extensive collections of its kind in the world. As you know, Dutch atlases are quite significant in the 17th and 18th century, and it's possible to have a comparison of collections, and it's the fourth one in the world. Only the Library of Congress, the British Library, and the University of Amsterdam have more copies than here. And there is also an extensive collection of non-Dutch material. But we're here in a museum, not just here in a library. This means that the museum has objects too, and the museum has a very fine collection of navigational instruments, and also have related collections as the tables which belong and are used for position finding and making of sea charts. So researchers on these subjects are very welcome to come to our museum and study them, and of course any other subject relating to Dutch maritime history, but also the maritime history of other European nations, and also things as the large trading companies, as the Dutch and West India Company, and everything related to the former Dutch colonies as Indonesia, for instance. I wish to thank especially Luis Lobo-Guerrero for contacting us to see if a presentation was possible in this museum. And we are very happy that we are all now here in the library, and we can listen and see the outcome of your request. And let's enjoy this afternoon here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diederick. I will say a few words about the volume as the very lucky editor of the series in which it appeared. Mapping Connectivity and the Making of European Empires is the second volume of a trilogy developed by Luis Lobo-Guerrero that explores how particular imaginaries and practices of connectivity bring new historical spaces into existence and infuse them with cultural and political meaning and efficacy. The trilogy actually embodies the spirit of the Global Epistemic series in many ways, and I'm very grateful to Luis for the opportunity to inaugurate the series with the first two volumes of the trilogy. Indeed, the series aims to promote interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research on knowledge in all its forms and manifestations, and specifically through a conceptually ambitious and rich engagement with the empirics of the emergence, evolution, and effects of knowledge on human society and human interactions through the ages. Of course, edited volumes are especially good formats to showcase advances in various fields of inquiry and develop collaborative research and conversations that take us beyond the current boundaries of academic disciplines and beyond field-specific concepts and methodologies. And the first two volumes of the trilogy exemplify this collaborative process, driven by a common objective, but constantly open to the unexpected opportunities that arise when each of us engages others on new terrains. Both volumes already published in the series exploit and nurture these opportunities in the way that they treat the tricky concept and complex reality of connectivity. So the first volume, Imaginaries of Connectivity, which came out in 2019, illuminated the many ways in which connections, connectivity, and connectivities are imagined, translated, embodied, and materialized, and made meaningful and efficient within and across particular temporalities, regimes of meaning, modes of reasoning, and spatialities. The second volume, which we are discussing today, investigates the connectivity effects of mapping and map-making on the constitution, materialization, and deployment of imperial power in different configurations and stages of Europe's imperial history. And I'm going to quote part of my editor's note in the volume. Empire in the volume is never assumed as the all-knowing, almighty, almost inevitable force that the knowledge power lens often makes it to be. Empires in the making are revealed as unpredictable networks of potential agencies, where the knowledge, ignorance, and imagination of makers, mediators, and consumers of maps conspire to turn blank or fanciful spaces into real and desirable territories, carrying new connections, resources, partitions, and performative worldviews. In carefully decentering the site of imperial knowledge from seats of power to multiple loci of epistemic praxis, this volume offers illuminating snapshots of historical connections established in mind, in matter, and in space, being translated into unpredictable pathways of expansion, rule, and control. In doing so, the volume enjoins us to also reflect on the sources of the worldviews and relations that we are about to create or lose as we engage with our own spaces of global connectivity. Unquote. So I expect that today's conversation will touch upon many of these topics, and it is a pleasure for me to now officially launch it by introducing our first speaker, Dr. Djoeke van Netten. Dr. van Netten is assistant professor in early modern history and the coordinator of the interdisciplinary master's degree in the Golden Age at the University of Amsterdam. She obtained her doctorate at the University of Groningen in 2012 for the book Koopman in Kennis about the Amsterdam publisher Willem Blauw. Her current research project is about secrecy in overseas companies around 1600. Dr. van Netten has been, amongst others, guest curator of the exhibition Blauw's World Map at the National Maritime Museum in Amsterdam. Djoeke, the floor is yours.
And first now I try to start my PowerPoint, not on my own computer. Can you see this? Okay, good. I try to, at the same time, look at the owl and then start. So thanks all of you here and attending online for having me. It's really an honor to be present at this occasion and at this location. First, we have a wonderful book, so and I like coming real things into present, and I'll say more about the book later. And second, we have this wonderful place. It's, as Diederick just said, it's a treasure trove full of maps and many, many more. The most impressive object of this museum probably is one you're even allowed to touch, namely the building itself. When I worked here as a museum guide, the building tour was my favorite, since by showing people the building, there is no self-evident storyline. There are almost no object labels prescribing your text, so the story has to be made at the spot. The building becomes a site of epistemological experimentation, or a playground for the historian. The best way to experience what I mean is what most people don't dare, or at least just don't do, but what my 7-year-old daughter always does first when she enters. That is just lying down on the floor and look at the ceiling. This roof, weighing 160,000 kilograms of steel plus 40,000 kilograms of glass, represents the geometry of maps without the map. Or could be, this is the most basic map at all. In the archives of the early Dutch East India companies, kept with some original travel journals, we find pieces of paper like this, apparently printed to be filled in on the way. This is the ultimate playground for cartographers. It invites improvising. One of the most wonderful experience ever I had here in this museum, lying down on that square under that ceiling. A concert was performed by 4 grand pianists. They played the Canto Ostinato, a composition by the Dutch composer Jean ten Holt. The work is remarkable for the amount of freedom it gives to the performers. Only small sections are written out. The rest is mostly harmonious repetitions, and it's up to the performers how long this lasts. The audience lied down and kept their eyes open, since the ceiling is magic. Every note of geometrical pattern is a LED light, 800 something different lights. I used to know all these numbers. But anyway, those LED lights can change into every color you like. While the pianists performed their obstinate song, a live light show was improvised with it. So this was the best parallel I could think of when reading the book. And the map as a playground, as a site where first cartographers and later historians working with maps improvise and tell stories. How maps define space and empire, and thinking about space and empire, much more than represent or let alone mirror them. If one thing sticks, the book shows how mapping is messy, full of contingencies, confused and confusing, full of failures and seeds for more discussion. And I hope we can start with that today. Being invited at the book launch is a dubious honor. Talking about a book that you haven't written while several of the authors are listening in is more than scary. The distance between you and the authors, comfortingly present when assessing a proposal or writing a review, has just melted away. And then, what actually is this book about? The title starts with mapping. As I just concluded, and several contributions in the book do conclude, mapping is messy, contingent, full of failures, etc., which doesn't leave much solid ground. Besides, the book argues at some point that mapping is not the same as making maps. It's a performative practice, it's a cognitive process that not necessarily results in producing what most people actually imagine when we talk about maps. While not explicitly mentioned, as far as I know, Svetlana Alper's mapping impulse comes to mind, an art historical concept that also doesn't necessarily result in maps, and of which I always wondered why art historians mostly don't apply it to maps and why map historians seem not to use them. Moreover, whenever I once wrote in a proposal something on the difference between the history of cartography and history of mapping, everyone outside that field asked please delete it. It only worked confusing. But map historian Dennis Wood already proclaimed cartography dead almost 3 decades ago, while Matthew Adney, frequently referred to in the book, showed how cartography is not fit to describe maps and mapping in the past. In practice, though, adding to the confusion, as this book shows, it's quite impossible to avoid cartography altogether when working with maps. Okay, then to the last word of the title, empires. If I understood correctly, they don't exist either. They are imagined and invented. And if they are stored with an adjective like Spanish or Dutch, this should be put within quotation marks to make even more sure that we shouldn't take them at face value. It got me thinking about Steve Shafer's book titled The Scientific Revolution, starting with the famous first sentence, "There was no such thing as a scientific revolution, and this is a book about it." After which he goes to great lengths to argue that the scientific and revolution are not the apt words to describe and explain the changing practices in the history of science in early modern times. And don't get me wrong, I like Shafer's book a lot, and I did like reading these inspirational chapters on mapping empires. The word bringing everything together is connectivity. The existence of connectivity is not doubted, though in a way it is so omnipresent and all-purpose deployable that I'm not completely certain if there is any history that cannot be told with it, which can be seen as weakness, but actually is a great strength. As for my own contribution to this nice afternoon in such a nice place, I decided to stretch or challenge some of the arguments a bit further, ideally put them to new promising directions, in that case probably overestimating my abilities. At least I can bring you a few short stories from my own experiences and perspectives. Coinciding with my expertise, these are mostly Dutch Amsterdam examples. As Reis already mentioned when I spoke to him last week, this book on mapping and empires contains surprisingly few examples on Dutch mapping or Dutch empires. Of course, it's also arguable that both of these didn't exist either. Don't get me wrong, this doesn't mean there is something wrong with the book, just that I hope it will inspire people working on mapping Dutch empires to take its arguments to heart. I thought of gendering my stories as well, though I haven't thought through this well enough. What I do merely observe is a complete lack of a gendered perspective on maps and mapping. Not just in this book, by the way. It has been made convincingly clear that maps are not a neutral playground. They are loaded with propaganda, politics, and rhetorics. Thus, I can't imagine them to be a gender-neutral playground either. But how masculinity plays out, or where femininity can be dragged in, still needs to be analyzed. There is some research on women in the map production and the map trade, and a lot of research on gendered spaces, though I have the impression the maps themselves don't figure prominently in these works. And please correct me if I'm wrong, anyone. A few short stories thus, not from my experience as a woman, but from my experience as someone having walked around in this museum in different roles. By far not as long and intense as people in Diederick, for example, who actually work here, though at least monthly, sometimes weekly, and for some periods even daily, walking in and out as a museum guide, as a research fellow, that's how it started over a decade ago now, and for a little while as a guest curator, as you already mentioned. Of course, my stories do relate to the book, highlighting themes I deem worthy of more consideration, and I'd love to talk about much longer with anyone listening in, and especially the people having provided us with so much food for thought already. Firstly, something about individuality. Much research in the history of cartography concerns itself with comparing editions and bibliographically and chronologically listing maps and atlases of a certain country or genre. This is super useful, super fundamental work, not only for antiquarians and collectors, but definitely for historians of mapping. But there is the risk of taking a map as an archetype much more than an individual object. And I have the impression that even historians of mapping sometimes stop short immediately after the production of a map. But by then, their lives only commenced. An extreme, but also an extremely telling example is this one. Two books with maps, same year, same title, same publisher, same edition, same book, question mark. It is a pilot guide covering the Mediterranean by Peter Goos, printed in Amsterdam, 1662. In a cartobibliography, this would be one entry, mentioning at the end that, among others, it's kept in Amsterdam at the University Library and in Amsterdam at the National Maritime Museum, full stop. Taking a closer look, however, these are two completely different objects. One bound and colored beautifully and expansively, dedicated to the authorities in Amsterdam. The other, uncolored, but obviously used, full of annotations, corrections, additions, and text and image. These objects are prime examples of mutable mobiles. Maps have social lives, as Martin Bruckner has shown, echoing Arjen Abderrah's social life of things. Even if maps embody standardizing practices, they shouldn't be considered as standardized items themselves. Yes, this is a plea for shifting the focus from production to consumption. And yes, this is a warning not to base research on digitized copies, let alone one digitized copy. And don't get me wrong, digitization is not a bad thing. On the contrary, I just like real things even better. Materiality matters. From materiality to modernity. The term modernity pops up several times in the book, suggesting that there is such a thing as modern mapping and modern territoriality, mostly having to do with geometry and linearity. Mapping as the cognitive process and the performative practice as understood here, and as in Alpert's mapping impulse, is an inherent modern characteristic. For example, Richard Helderson and Simon Vernon have concluded, I map, therefore I am, is much more apt than I map. They concluded that I map, therefore I'm modern should be used instead of I map, therefore I am. So from that perspective, early moderns are very modern. And let's show you an early modern worldview, quite specifically that of Johann Blau, dated 1648. As I argued elsewhere, this worldview can be characterized as Euro-superior, male-dominated, so here we have a gender thing, pro-Dutch, or even more precise, pro-Holland, and consequently anti-Catholic and anti-Spanish, even if the map is dedicated to a Spanish diplomat, thanking him for bringing about the Peace of Westphalia. It is a celebration of a new world order established after 1648, in which Hollandia ruled the waves. Apart from the political message, which I won't say much more about, there is a story about modernity that can be told with this map. Thierry Brodden, in his popular A History of the World in 12 Maps, has called exactly this map the first to be, quote, immediately recognizable as a modern map of the world. Brodden's statement seems to imply that there are modern and pre-modern world maps. What the defining factor would be, he does not comment on. But if we compare this world map with earlier ones, it must have to do with the delineating of coastlines of continents. This has to be concluded since the biggest novelty is the appearance of what we now call Australia and the disappearance of what Ortelius had named the not yet known Southland, the Terra Australis non incognita. Back to map. Even if nova was a quite common adjective in the titles of 17th century maps and atlases, the fact that it is the first word in the title of this map shows how Blau, and others at other places, regarded their maps at the forefront of published knowledge. In the text, and this is the text below in Latin and French, I know you can't read it. So in this text below, it starts with an explanation to amateurs of geography, and it is hitherto completely ignored in research. And just one gendered remark. In French, Blau addresses Monsieur, implying at least half of the world's population apparently is not interested in geography. In this text, Blau several times dismisses ancient ideas and boasts how much has been discovered in recent times. Whole continents, but also people living much farther north than classical knowledge had it, and much more stars by the use of the, quote, new invented telescope. As a perfect modern scientist, in a Max Weberian sense, Blau is optimistic and confident that even his own knowledge will soon be superseded as well. He tells that the one yet unknown part of the world, so he counts 6 parts of the world, which 3 were known in ancient times, 2 in modern times discovered. The last is the unknown Southland, not delineated, but very well present on this map, where you can, if you are much, much closer, you can read Austrasia incognita. It will soon be discovered. This ties in with several of the contributions in your book about expeditions to find known unknowns, be they in the white cold north or in the dark heart of Africa. For people who want to sail to the yet unknown Southland, Blau provides this fascinatingly empty little map with South Pole projection. He literally says this for people who want to sail there. And so this again is a geometrical playground waiting for a 17th century Vespucci. The last story happens where I like to end my museum guide tour through the building, connecting the past with the present. The tour starts exactly in the middle of the square, pointing to the arches and the sidelines, explaining these are typical characteristics of the architectural style called Dutch Classicism, also recognizable, for example, in the palace before City Hall in Dam Square. After a tour from the basement to the already mentioned magic geometrical ceiling, invoking compasses on maps, we encounter a brick wall. It is not particularly aesthetically pleasing, interfering with the arches and the sidelines. Even though it actually has a text label, a bit hidden on the other side of the room, almost every visitor passes without notice. The brick wall, however, is art. Conceptual art, established when the museum reopened after serious renovation in 2011. The story is one from the Scottish artist Netten, who wondered what European ships brought to the other side of the world in a period sometimes described as the age of discovery, the age of exploration, or the age of empires. We all know what we Europeans brought home and how this made, for example, Amsterdam rich. Mostly spices and other Asian luxuries, sometimes with profit rates of over 400%. But since a ship cannot sail without ballast, what was shipped the other way around? The answer, or at least an important partial answer, is bricks. Bricks, just as ballast, and since they were shipped anyway, used to build with in Dutch overseas settlements. Bringing back the ballast, however, appeared more tricky than initially thought. Perhaps you can imagine some accusations of neo-colonial behavior when someone from Europe proposes to ship bricks in Indonesia or Suriname back to the Netherlands. In the end, what happened was a container with early modern bricks from the Netherlands sailing over the 7 seas, visiting places where Dutch ships once had brought their bricks, picking up underway a few more early modern bricks in, amongst other, Fremantle, Australia, and on some still Dutch ruled islands in the Caribbean. Back in Amsterdam, this wall was built, purposefully interfering with sidelines and easy lines of thought, asking, as Koning himself put it, what did we do to those people? I'm not sure if I do or should feel included in this we, but I do think the question has to be asked over and over again. What I also like about this book, about mapping connectivity in the empires, is that it consciously tells a Eurocentric story and at the same time aims to overcome Eurocentrism. This is mostly a matter of awareness. And if after reading the book or after this event, you have raised awareness of mapping, especially mapping empires, being complicated, messy, confusing and confused, contingent and full of failures, and even possibly non-existent, this is great. I hope this will serve as an exhortation, an impulse to keep visiting and revisiting the playground, to perform obstinate stones, to improvise, and to tell more wonderful stories. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Djoeke, for this wonderful engagement with the book, which has, I think, addressed so many different aspects, and you've woven so many interesting threads that I hope we'll have the chance to fully discuss with the editors and also with the audience. Our next speaker is one of the co-editors of the book, Dr. Laura Presti, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Landscapes of Human Mobility's Visual Imageries project at the Center for Advanced Studies in Mobility and the Humanities, which is hosted at the University of Padova. She's been visiting research fellow at Groningen University, and her current research focuses on the cultural ecologies and the technological and political conditions that allow maps and mapping to elicit a plethora of discourses, actions, and feelings about the European migrant crisis and its forms of hierarchized mobilities. Her publications include a book published in 2019 entitled Cartografie inesauste, and several articles, including The Migrancies of Maps, published in 2020, Like a Map Over Troubled Water, Terraqueous Necropolitics, Extroverting Cartography, and Maps in/Out of Place. Welcome, Laura. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm very actually happy to take these few minutes to talk a little bit more about my experience actually in co-editing the book, because I should say that actually I'm a cultural geographer and a political geographer, as you said, broadly interested, let's say, in Mediterranean space and its mobilities, and above all, a wide range of critical and performative cartographies. So I was profoundly grateful and excited to take up this invitation and to move into diving within, let's say, to navigate, wonder, and especially listen to what maps have to say about imaginaries and practices of connectivity involved in the making of empire. Though, of course, like international relations, IR was not exactly my disciplinary academic field. So I think that the way in which also I answered some of the core questions that we wanted to address as a research group in the book may to some extent locate me, let's say, sometimes on other points or on the edge of this map of European imperial connectivity that we wanted to trace. However, actually, I think we all, as a research group, and I specifically, always valued very seriously and positively the idea and the practice of interdisciplinarity. And so my PhD that was in European cultural studies, so not specifically anchored in, let's say, an academic discipline, although my supervisor was a geographer, and not specifically also, let's say, rooted in international context. Somehow prepared me in thinking about the diverse ways in which European societies, past and present, or the reality, make sense of life and communicate meaning across a range of disciplines and in a wide variety of media. So this is exactly actually what I was expecting from this editorial project and what really I wanted to contribute to. So thinking about the mapping and empire nexus across a wide range, let's say, of theoretical and methodological tools and in a wide variety of media. But of course, we were, let's say, just a niche, you know, a selected group. So we couldn't really explore all the aspects that, of course, are very crucial and have been mentioned before. But I enthusiastically took part in this project because really I could see and feel that there was a great interest, there was excitement in looking, studying, and analyzing maps and mapping, not, I would say, as ancillary tools to the core team, the empire, but really as a medium that could take central stage in the formation, in the consolidation, in the circulation of the idea of empire through this notion of connectivity. And this aspect was actually very dear to me because I really like to look at maps and mapping both in their material and practical potential, but also in the figurative and, let's say, representational one. So that when Lewis talked about this concept, this idea of connectivity, I think they really could infer mapping with a new life and dynamism precisely before, like in the field of geography and cultural geography, and let's say the critical geographers are usually kind of exhausted, let's say, by work and books and studies and maps, precisely for this convention that they're exhausted and dead. And indeed, through connectivity, I would say they're really mapping maps. It could be re-explored with new and fresh insights, both for IR scholars, geographers, and humanities scholars in the world. Of course, I had encountered the term connectivity in different domains, but its use was somehow kind of restrictive from the one that Lewis encouraged us to address as this complex conditions and possibility of the terms under which something is made to connect and disconnect or remain connected. For instance, in Mediterranean studies, and precisely in their book, The Corrupting Sea, Orden and Purcell had engaging extensively with the term connectivity, that there became a kind of way of characterizing the ease, the facility of communication between one place and another in a much broader sense. Or ultimately, we could say that the term originating around the 60s in the mathematical graph theory and was usually applied by geographer into the analysis of regional road networks. So that's, we could say that any space that can be modeled by one line joining two nodes is trivially connective. But during our meeting, I think we had to discuss, we often discussed the fact of giving a specific definition or a legacy of this term connectivity, which in any case I already deeply explored in the first book of the series edited by Luis. But in the end, I think I like this idea to somehow release, to free the term from any, let's say, historical or academic legacy, and instead address it as a kind of elastic, a much more elastic category, let's say a portal, an entryway through which the relationship between mapping and empire could be understood, could be made sense together, but each time in a different way. In the sense, I would say, as the same philosopher, Gilles Deleuze would say, there are only, let's say, inexact words to designate something exactly. So the way in which connectivity, when that was then tactically used by the different authors, makes them understand how notions of entanglement, connectivity, circulation, relationality may really be embraced at any possible scale and imagination, drawing, for instance, in post-structuralism, specifically the work of Bruno Latour, or post-humanism, phenomenology, and so forth. And another expert that I also valued very positively in this experience was this idea to go against or beyond any state-centric perspective, which was something particularly felt, of course, in the discipline of of international relations. But this was also quite new for me, in the sense that, as I told you before, I was raised during my PhD in the cultural studies and European cultural studies. This was a kind of interdisciplinary, let's say, field that was already born against the claim of any methodological, let's say, nationalism. But then paradoxically, in my own study on the Imaginaries of Connectivity enacted by fascist imperial maps in Italy that you find the last chapter of the book, this nexus of empire and nation could not, of course, be easily disentangled or even neglected, because what is called then the beggar imperialism of Italy, the poor imperialism of Italy, and its aspiration for Africa were, of course, very, very tight and used for national building purposes. So I think was really important for us was then to discuss each notion of state or nation state or empire in each historical and geographical context. Then I should say, also thinking still about this idea of the connectivity, the term connectivity, or also trying to imagine what could be the effect, this historical readings, even in the present, is that we should not even, of course, neglect the fact that now with the pace of the pandemic, there are often many substantial claims for disconnection, for non-relationality, disentangled, so since borders and selected corridors and between also states are more important than ever. So in terms of new tools, I've been left with this editorial project. I would say that this book also leaves the reader with a kind of urgency that we really need more work, and the issues of connectivity and its Janus phase, this connectivity, as much as of mapping and unmapping, or mobility and immobility. And really to conclude, I would say that since through this book, we had somehow explored the map and mapping practices, or mapping impulses, as been said before, as powerful representations and political technology of the state, nation state, and empires, but in a very, I would say, novel way, so which is kind of processual, contingent, empirical, or post-representational. I really would expect to see also more work on ways now in which the same dynamic, let's say, reading, the same dynamic focus maybe also tell has a little bit more how the order, any political order also get dismantled or decentered by harnessing the insights emerging also from counter mapping, radical cartographies, indigenous mapping, maybe also feminist approach, of course, to mapping and cartographies, and all the everyday ontologies, geographies, and experiences, let's say also personal security and insecurity. Let's say, I hope that this book in the hand will leave also the reader with a kind of urgency and an effort on activating, let's say, new modes of perceptions of the political space, and perhaps may encourage the readers to let themselves invent languages they may speak in the interstices, let's say, of these major tongues. So I think I will finish now and I'll let the others speak.
Thank you very much, Laura. I think it's particularly interesting to hear about the process that brought you all together from, very different academic cultures and mental habits and interests. And to see how all this converged in a new conversation, and hopefully this is only the beginning of such conversations on connectivity and other related issues. We will now hear from the second co-editor of the volume, Dr. Filipe dos Reis, who is Assistant Professor of Geopolitics and Connectivity at the University of Groningen. Dr. dos Reis completed his PhD in International Relations at the University of Erfurt, where he also held a position as Research Associate or Wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter, and has been a member at the Interdisciplinary Center of Political Practices and Orders. His current research focuses on the history and politics of international law, Imperial Germany, and of course, maps. He is the co-editor of a wonderful volume that has recently been published with Palgrave Macmillan, entitled The Politics of Translation in International Relations. So Filipe, congratulations to you and your co-editors as well on the publication of this volume. Welcome, and we are ready to listen to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Inanna. Thank you. Also first of all, to all the authors and editors. It was a very nice process, and I'm very grateful about it because I learned a lot of things. What I really enjoyed about, and I will start with a couple of words about the editing process as well. What I really enjoyed was that it was a group with a good size in order to follow the work closely of everyone. So it was not a very big edited volume with, let's say, 20 chapters or something like that, but something with 6 authors, 6 chapters. Where we have also had the opportunity to meet each other for a couple of times for intensive multi-day authors workshop in Palo first of all, but then also in Copenhagen, organized by Jeppe Strandsberg, whom I see in the audience, at least his name. What I really liked about it is that it was possible to read all the drafts for every one of us in the editorial team, and also to see the process of the different papers. Authoring this is of course a bit of a performative process, a process which goes on. And of course, if we think like that, as Djoeke in her short her intervention said, it's maybe something which is not always over, right? So I really hope that this volume brings up some ideas and inspiration. So maybe today is also part of authoring. What I want to say about more the content of the volume, which I really learned, I think, about maps and empire during this process, and I'm very happy that Laura just spoke about the third concept, which is connectivity, because I won't speak that much about it, is that I learned something about how we can conceptualize maps and empires in a very interesting way, because we think about maps and often also empires as something very, very spatial. What we see somehow in the different contributions, I think, is also that there's also some kind of a temporal dimension to maps and empires. So maps are not just about space. Empires are not just something which is a political entity who are organized side by side and just there, but they are emerging, they interact, they trade, they fight, they seize. And maps also change over time and can't somehow fix space, although we think they do. And one of the vantage points in my chapter and also in the way I think about maps was a bit the work of Bruno Latour, and particularly his early work. And I usually don't take everything he says for granted, but some of the things I find interesting as a starting point to think about things. So one of his distinctions is the one between a ostensive and a performative definition of things. So in an ostensive definition, you somehow fix an object. And as he writes, whatever happens in the index of the onlocker, the definition remains. In a performative definition, this vanishes. And the idea is more to look into the way concepts change over time and how ideas change over time. And it is not possible, of course, to fix concepts, and one can do it in different ways. I mean, Deleuze was already mentioned. So concepts need to be performed. And I think we did so in this volume with regard to both concepts, the concept of empire and the concept of maps. Empires, and this was already mentioned. I mean, sometimes we had formulations, and also in some of the chapters, maybe that there is not one European empire, not one mode of European empire, but that it is more important to look into the making of empires as something which is never over. Empires are always empires in the making. They are always about processes of dynamic stabilization, of hierarchization, of ordering. So empires in itself need to be explained. They are not just explaining things. And and this gives also some kind of an opportunity to compare things. So comparison here is not just about that things are similar, but also about what is different. And this is something we also tried to do in this volume by having so many different chapters. Tackling so different things, like, for example, medieval Danish imperial aspirations in Greenland by Jeppe, but also then the last chapter by Laura about fascist Italy. And this is, of course, very different, but this gave us some kind of an idea to tackle these kind of things. And second of all, maps are also like that. So maps are also not fixed. They are also about something which is always going on. So I think all the chapters share this idea of a more or less post-representational idea of mapping. So so maps are always in the making as well. And this is what I found interesting, not something completely new. One of the map makers I looked into, the main character of my chapter, which is on German imperial mapping, is August Petermann, who was a map maker in the mid-19th century, quite a famous map maker at that time. And he wrote about explorations, and he never left his place. So he always sent out missions. And he wrote about mapping, that that maps are something like a perpetuum mobile. They always come back. So you send an explorer traveler, as he calls it, out, and something comes back. And he's very aware of this kind of process. And the way he draws maps and he works with maps, they are never fixed and stable. So maybe to conclude, I think it is interesting to look into these kind of processes and also to problematize ideas of how things are stabilized then. This will also help us to understand imperial maps as something where we can also inquire into the mechanisms of how empires are stabilized in the end. So I think I will leave it here as well.
Thank you very much, Filipe. Last but not least, Dr. Luis Lobo-Guerrero, the mastermind behind this trilogy. Dr. Lobo-Guerrero is Professor of History and Theory of International Relations at the University of Groningen, where he is also Director of the Center for International Relations Research. His current work explores the invention of globality in the early modern period. And as part of the trilogy of books of which this volume is one element, he was also the co-editor of Imaginaries of Connectivity, the creation of novel spaces of governance, together with Subi Alt and Martin Meyer, which was published by Rowman and Littlefield, as I mentioned, in 2019 or 2020. And Luis has also written a trilogy of his own with 3 monographs, which were entitled respectively Ensuring Security, Biopolitics, Security and Risk, which came out with Routledge in 2011, Ensuring War, Sovereignty, Security and Risk in 2012, and Ensuring Life, Value, Security and Risk in 2016. Luis, you have actually more time than expected, and I think that this is because my own introduction was shorter than planned. So please feel free to, in addition to your originally planned intervention, to perhaps provide more context about the trilogy or the volumes, link back to what your co-editors have said, and of course, perhaps engage a bit more substantially with Djoeke's intervention, since we will have more time to dedicate to that. Luis, please.
Thank you very much, Inanna, and thank you very much to all of you for being here and for being so generous with your thoughts and your ideas, and Diederick and Maria for making this happen here at the library. I'm greatly honored for that. When I was thinking about what to say today at this wonderful book launch, I had mixed feelings and I had different ideas in my mind. So I settled this morning for a couple, but I might bring up some of those other ideas as I speak. And the first point has to do with what led to thinking of this book trilogy, but also what led to think of this specific volume on mapping connectivity and the making of the European empire. And the first thought that came to mind some years ago was that we tend to think of the world as already connected. We assume that the world is connected. We assume that the world is connected in very particular ways, and that it has been connected in such ways at very particular times. But when we start looking into things, we realize that it's not so nice, it's not so easy, it's not so connected as we thought it was. When taking a historical approach, we tend to see, and some tend to show us, very nice and neat narratives of what happened, how things came about, the causes that led to phenomena, and the consequences. And this is the typical historical textbook narrative that we see in school curricula. Yet, when we engage with what appears to be settled matters, such as the existence of empires, their histories, and their operations, we quickly find that the categories we use to refer to them, although convenient and neat, create more questions than answers. Very topical today is to pass judgment, moral judgment, of what is referred to as imperial experiences, European imperialism, and colonial practices. We see racial attitudes in all things imperial and colonial, and rightly so. They are highly racialized. But when we engage with the details of what seems to stabilize ideas of imperialism and colonialism, we find that these terms are far too general to describe particular phenomena. We find that the knowledges involved in any so-called practice of empire and of colonial experimentation can show us very rich experiences of power that are concealed when we label them as racist, Western, white, Christian, or any other label for the classification of experience and phenomena. What we find in our intellectual excursions of this volume, with this wonderful team that we assembled to prepare this book, We find that whenever we approach maps, they do not show us a stable vision of anything, but they show us aspirations towards an ordered world, according to beliefs, forms of knowing, systems of governance, and the imaginaries that make the world we inhabit. As I discuss in the preface to the book, that I forgot how I entitled, but it's quite funny here. Let me just look at that. Yeah, I called it Poseidonians and the Tragedy of Mapping European Empires. What I try to say that there is that maps are aspirations to empire. They're not descriptions or they're not images of empire, but just aspirations to empire. Now, the second point I want to make here has to do with the idea of connectivity. So that the world that we assume to be connected and that has been connected in the past reveals to ourselves as unstable formations. And that unstable formations that we consider to be connected become our playground. So what we do in this volume, both collectively and individually, is to problematize those connected worlds, or so-called connected worlds. We ask, what are the maps expected to connect? What are the very terms under which those connections take place? And what are the implications of those connections? In doing so, these so apparently banal questions, we end up having a very different narrative from official narrative political stories. We end up observing power relations that had been veiled by the imperial narratives taught in school curricula or in popular media, such as films. Films are wonderful, but we forget that they are art. They're not necessarily telling us the world as it is, they're inviting us to think about the world. They're not necessarily factual history. Now, mapping objects such as cartography, and the distinction we made between mapping and cartography, cartography is an instance of mapping, not the only one. Mapping objects such as cartography end up being for us as a group then, not empirical objects, but epistemological problems. They do not reveal a world, but become sites from which we can come to know the world of those who have mapped and who map, and those who observe the maps, or for whom the maps were drawn. Maps are, in our terms, sites for experimentation, where we, as researchers, experiment with the unstable images, with the map makers, with their expected audience, with their intellectual and material techniques, but most importantly, with our own imaginaries of power, of space, of culture, and our own cosmologies. In that respect, us as viewers of maps become part of the map, and our emotions, our affections, our beliefs become part of the map. And if we are already approaching the map with ready-made categories of thought, we might very likely find them in the map. But if we assume maps as sites of experimentation, not to test our hypothesis or beliefs as rational science would have it, if we approach the map as being not outside the problem matter, we can assume a contrary approach. That didn't make much sense, but I'll explain. To assume maps as sites of experimentation is precisely to think with them, not through them. To think outside of the experiment we expect them to be a result of. It's not taking them as validations of a hypothesis of a spatialized power designed and thought of at a center of calculation, to use the Latourian term, such as Seville, Paris, Copenhagen, London, Washington, Beijing, Moscow, whichever imperial capital we can think of. Maps as sites of experimentation is an experience of being with the map, not being through the map, but being with the map, of thinking with the map, of using the map to formulate questions rather than seeking to find answers to ready-made questions or to validate our current categories of thought, such as empire and imperialism, the colonial and colonization, class systems and processes of classification, gendered stereotypes, or gendering forms of life. Last week I was giving a presentation on my current work at NIAS, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, which is co-hosting this event. And during the discussion, something very nice came out. Is rather than talking about gendering the map, how about we think about querying the map? And there's something quite exciting that could come out of that. Now, such an approach to mapping, that is, assuming maps as sites of experimentation for the playground that we have playfully referred to in these presentations, allows us then to open up spaces for thinking critically, not morally, about the creation of spaces through which individuals' lives and forms of life are governed. So these are the thoughts that I have prepared for today, but given that we can say, I can take a couple of minutes to say something more, I want to reflect on my experience with editing this book, or my experience with fostering the editing of this book, because the editing was not an individual process at all. It was a collective process of mostly 3 individuals, but that was only the last part of the project. So I want to tell you the behind the scenes a little bit, which is quite interesting. And it's that all the authors involved in the book, with the exception of Louis Littlefield, who came later at the end of the process, we constituted a research group, and we met several times in wonderful locations. We started, we have different meetings anyway. But what was really nice about that was that we read each other's work, and we discussed each other's work. And we asked each of the members to share the most important texts in cartography and mapping that they had read before. So we had a lot to read. We shared, and each one of us presented the texts that we liked. So it became an embodied experience of editing, which is what I really, really enjoy. At some point, we had to make decisions, also in discussions with the publishers, that we could not co-edit between the 5 of us. We had to make some executive decisions at some point. We couldn't talk endlessly, and that worked out really, really nice. Then when the chapters started to come in, through some editorial guidelines that we have provided, we all commented on the different chapters, and that actually fertilized the discussion. But as in any editorial project, or in any curatorial project, as you would know really well, what shines out ultimately is what was not included. And what was not included also helps define what was included in the project. And of course, there are very important, significant exclusions in the book. We had to think very hard if we wanted to include all the European empires that had taken place in the modern period. And we realized, no, because this is not meant to be an encyclopedic project. In fact, any of the cases that we deal with in the book are instances of the problem. What we're really interested in doing here is to tease out and to discuss intellectually the problem of mapping European empire from a connectivity approach. So we should have, or perhaps shouldn't have, included some cases, but it doesn't really matter, because I think the ones that we included did allow us to work the problems through. Now, in the context of the trilogy of edited volumes on power, qualitative connectivity in space, the second volume does something very nice, and here I'm talking about let's say the editor of the whole trilogy, and is that it sets up incredibly nicely what the third volume is going to be about. And the third volume is going to be about navigation, connectivity, and the opening up of space. And it's wonderful because now we have something very solid to ground ourselves on. There's going to be another editorial team, of which Inanna will be part, and Nicholas Gekle, who is somewhere in the virtual audience. We're going to be co-editors there, and we have a lineup of very exciting writers, some of which I see are in the attendance list as well. So I'm very grateful for this. I'm very grateful for the opportunity that the research team has afforded us in order to discuss this kind of things, and incredibly grateful for the generosity of those who are coming to participate in the project, not least Djoeke today, Michael van Grusen, who was going to speak today, who couldn't come for some very important family reasons, and of course Diederick, who's here as well, and my colleagues at ES, and so on. I'm going to leave it there, Inanna. The floor goes back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Luis. Thanks to everyone. I think you've given us almost a comprehensive view of how the project developed and all your different perspectives.